Welcome to another episode of Watchdog on Mint Press. We are joined this week by some amazing guests. As you know, each week we are going against the grain with searing investigative journalism, which is often neglected by the mainstream media. So we hope that you can support us, whether through Patreon, if you can, or by sharing or liking or commenting on this video. Now, this week I am joined by filmmaker and journalist Pablo Navarrete, and I'm also joined for a second time by a very popular guest last time we had him on, the investigative journalist John McAvoy. Thank you very much for joining us today, gentlemen. And we are talking about John and Pablo's recent story on Mint Press around the Guardian newspaper and Julian Assange. So to start with, John, it's been established that UC Global, the private security company that were tasked with securing the Ecuadorian Embassy, were actually, through Sheldon Adelson, working for US intelligence during this time and spying on Julian Assange. Some of their assignments entailed things like stealing the nappies of Julian and Stella Morris's child to determine the paternal relationship of Julian to the child. Some of their tasks in the surveillance extended to the recording of conversations, or at least the recording of the inside of the toilets, and also the spying on private conversations between Julian Assange and his legal team. So just as a first question, what was the extent of UC Global's spying on Assange, and even, as you revealed, Ecuadorian intelligence? And how did that agreement between UC Global and the US government come about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because the extent of UC Global spying on Assange, now bear in mind, as you said, that they were originally employed by SENAIN, Ecuador's intelligence agency, to actually protect the Ecuadorian Embassy in London, and therefore protect Assange to make sure that nothing untoward was going outside the embassy. We know that British intelligence officials and a number of other intelligence officials were closely monitoring the Ecuadorian embassy, and it wasn't. Assange's safety was not in any case secure at all. So, how did the relationship between UC Global and Sheldon Adelson actually begin? Well, David Morales, who was the CEO of UC Global, he went to a security an arms fair in Las Vegas in 2016. And bear in mind that David Morales at this time is basically just a private mercenary. He'll sell his services, his security services, to the highest bidder. So at this this arms fair at Las Vegas Sands, David Morales meets Sheldon Adelson, who owns the hotel. He's a Trump mega donor. He's also very good friends with, at this time, the CIA director Mike Pompeo. So they develop a relationship. And obviously, David Morales' contract at the Ecuadorian Embassy in London is extremely important. It's an extremely valuable contact to have for the US security services, especially bearing in mind that in 2017, WikiLeaks starts revealing the Cablegate, and Cablegate was the biggest CIA leak in CIA history. It was extremely embarrassing for the agency. And I mean, that's the level of embarrassment to the agency is revealed in the recent Yahoo News article that showed that the CIA actually planned to kidnap or assassinate Assange on British soil shortly after those leaks were revealed. So you get this relationship developing between Sheldon Adelson and David Morales, the CEO of UC Global. And as you say, UC Global ramp up their spying operation on Assange massively. I mean, prior to this relationship, there were only CCTV cameras in the Ecuadorian embassy, so they weren't actually recording video. They weren't recording audio. And I mean, it gets to the point in 2017, as you say, when Romy Vallejo, who's the head of Ecuador's intelligence services, Now, UC Global, that's been employed directly by Romy Vallejo, is listening through the door, they're listening through the walls, they're taking video evidence, they're taking audio evidence of Julian Assange's private conversations and meetings with the head of Ecuadorian intelligence. And then they're passing this on, and this has came out in the ongoing trial that's taking place in Spain, in Madrid at the moment. So they're sending this video and audio footage directly to what we have to presume was David Morales' handlers in the US intelligence agencies, basically to gather as much information on Assange as possible to prevent him from leaving the Ecuadorian Embassy by way of diplomatic immunity. Sorry. So I mean, as you said, the level of spying was absolutely insane. I mean, I'm told that in the Spanish case, UC Global were taking pictures of the door frames, of the doorknobs, of the window latches, of all of the windows, which clearly suggests that UC Global are collaborating in an attempt to allow the CIA to kidnap Assange, basically, providing the necessary details for a kidnap attempt. I mean, long story short, you've got a private security firm that's been contracted to protect Assange, gets turned by US intelligence agencies, and then embarks on this absolutely perverse spying operation against Assange, which includes monitoring, his day-to-day activities, including in the women's toilets where he had to conduct private conversations, and this will hopefully all come out in great detail in the Spanish court process that's going on at the moment.
So that's a hell of a piece of information for any journalist, right? Surely you would assume that a journalist that got hold of this piece of information, that the private company who were employed to secure the embassy were in fact spying for US intelligence. Well, it seems that Stephanie Kirchgeisner, the Guardian reporter, seemed to have knowledge of this in her communications with a UC Global employee. These communications are revealed in your article. And so the question would have to be asked, if Stephanie Kirchgeisner of The Guardian did know this to be the case, why did she not make it public or even problematize it in communications?
Yeah. Sorry, Pablo, did you want to say that?
No, I mean, exactly. And that's why it's so important that Stephanie and others who have worked on the two pieces that we highlighted in the Mint Press, which is only two pieces out of a lot of coverage that The Guardian has done with Julian Assange. But we concentrate on these two sort of explosive pieces that made news worldwide. And what we're saying is that until these questions sort of credibly answered, you can only conclude that there's been very serious journalistic malpractice. It doesn't make sense for her to have known this almost a year before it became publicly first exposed in El País, and for her to have sat on this information. It's very strange, and she really, I think she needs to, for her own journalistic reputation, reply to some of these questions that are laid out very kind of succinctly at the end of the article. I don't know, John, if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from these communications that we've obtained, we know that Stephanie Kirchgeisner knew two things prior to them ever becoming public knowledge. The first of those things was that Assange's private communications were not only being recorded, but they were being transcribed by the private security service that had been, employed to protect Assange. The second thing that we know is that Kirchgeisner knew that there was a relationship between Sheldon Adelson, this Trump mega donor, the Ecuadorian embassy spying operation, and UC Global. So, I mean, what this tells us is that she was privy to quite important knowledge much before many, I assume, other journalists were, and especially the public. And I think it speaks to the level of solidarity that journalists had at this time with Assange. I mean, she was aware that his private conversations were being transcribed. And instead of publishing that as the story, instead of publishing the story that, Assange's security detail are actually spying on him, she decided to sit on that knowledge and pursue Assange as a supposed subject of Russian malfeasance. So I think it kind of tells you what questions journalists were asking at this time, and they weren't asking the right questions.
And sorry, just to interrupt there, and I think it also speaks to that kind of wider relationship, which we don't go into really. We provide some context, but about The Guardian and Julian Assange, a newspaper, that WikiLeaks partnered with alongside a range of other sort of mainstream newspapers initially, but then that relationship soured, and to the extent that a password was apparently released in a book co-authored by one of the authors of the pieces that we looked at, Luke Harding, and the investigations editor, by The Guardian, recklessly putting a number of US government information out to the public recklessly, and this is something WikiLeaks accused The Guardian of, and they didn't really have a credible defense. So this is a kind of relationship between a media organization and a journalist, which was used to win the Guardian Awards when it was good for them, but they seem to have dropped him, and not only dropped him, but almost been at the vanguard or at the spearheading a campaign of vilification by the mainstream media, which I think to a large extent explains why the British public feel so little sympathy for him today, why essentially we have a publisher sitting in a British high security prison, facing the threat of being extradited to face 175 years in jail in a US supermax. And I think The Guardian's relationship with Julian Assange kind of speaks to that lack of solidarity, but also I think it's something that goes beyond that.
Yeah. I think also an interesting part of this is the knowledge that Sheldon Adelson, when you look at where he puts his money, he's solidly of the right in the US, one of the biggest funders in history of illegal Israeli settlements in Palestine. It would discredit the idea that Assange, and this was a carefully constructed mythology, was somehow of the right. And this is where Paul Manafort comes into it. If we were to be clear that Sheldon Adelson, a Trump mega donor, was involved in this surveillance of Assange, then how would that cast, what kind of light would that cast on this claim around Paul Manafort? What was the claim around him? And what was the veracity of that claim?
Yeah, so in November, the 27th of November 2018, The Guardian published what looked like one of the biggest bombshell reports of the decade, maybe, which stated as fact that in 2013, 2014, 2015 and 2016, Paul Manafort, who in the summer of 2016 became Donald Trump's key campaign manager, claimed that Julian Assange had been hosting private meetings with Paul Manafort on 3 separate occasions, one of which supposedly coincided with the time that he became the campaign manager for Donald Trump. And obviously this tied in with the prevailing narrative at the time, the prevailing liberal narrative at the time of Russiagate, which basically claimed that WikiLeaks had collaborated with the Trump campaign and Russia to basically swing the election in favor of Donald Trump. Incredibly, a very liberal narrative that showed a total lack of self-awareness on the shortcomings of Hillary Clinton and on the Democrats in general. So you've got this narrative that's been fed through all of the media at this time. And I feel like that's really reflected in both of these stories. I mean, both of them are trying to make this connection between the Trump campaign, Julian Assange, and Russia. I mean, even despite the fact that Assange, when WikiLeaks had published a trove of documents about Russia, he'd publicly said that, I mean, I think Trump or Clinton is like deciding between chlamydia or gonorrhea. I mean, he was quite clear that he's, based on his leaking record, based on his political views, that he had no sympathy for the Trump campaign. He certainly had no sympathy for the Clinton campaign neither. I mean, Clinton had overtly said, "Why don't we just drone bomb this guy?" So I mean, the narrative that this spun was basically that Assange was being used as a tool of Russian disinformation or Russian malign influence in US politics and in Western politics. But it's quite interesting to see what happened in the immediate aftermath of this article being published. I mean, the authors, Luke Harding, Stephanie Kirsch-Geisner again, and Dan Collins, all walked back on this article. It got immediately edited to say sources say that Paul Manafort visited Assange in the embassy. So they changed it from a statement of fact to a statement of opinion from a source that they didn't bother to name. They also, qualified large parts of the article to move it from statements of fact to statements of coming from a third party, from their unnamed source. And I mean, since then, Luke Harding has published a book called Shadow State. I mean, the entire subject matter of the book is about supposed Russian malign influence in Western democracies, which I'm sure there is a certain degree of, but certainly incredibly inflated by Luke Harding. And in this book, he makes zero mention whatsoever of this apparent meeting between Manafort and Assange in the embassy in 2016, which is quite an incredible statement, really, from Harding, that he has absolutely no faith in one of the biggest scoops that he's revealed in in his entire career. And it also speaks to the total lack of accountability. I mean, we're talking about Russian disinformation, for example, alleged Russian disinformation in the 2016 election campaign. But here you've got The Guardian, whose chief reporter has walked back on a massive claim, and they've provided no corrections. They've provided no notes, not least any apology to Assange or any of the people that they lied about. So yeah, I mean, it speaks a lot to the integrity of the Western media at the moment. That such an incredible fabrication can remain on the website's page, without any apology, any retraction. Yeah.
Also, what's interesting is they watered down the Manafort story, but it's still up. There was the other story about supposedly Assange escaping to Russia that was actually climbed down on by The Guardian. What was that climb down like? And were there any consequences of this?
I mean, maybe John can talk more specifically, but the end process of that climb down was a report by the kind of internal reviewer that the Guardian has, the Scott Trust, headed by a gentleman that I think has his mentor and production company, whose company produces, interestingly, Newsnight, a number of BBC programs, a number of documentaries. In fact, he produced a documentary on David Dimbleby going to Russia to investigate Putin's Russia. But he was the chair of that board, which essentially concluded that article had been misleading and broke the sort of, the kind of internal rules that the Guardian had.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the first stories that attempted to associate Assange with a kind of Russian with the Russian state, basically, that appeared in The Guardian. What it claimed was that when Assange was trying to leave the Ecuadorian Embassy in London in late 2017, his health was declining, and basically his legal team tried to find him a way to get to a third country by offering him a diplomatic immunity. If he was posted as a diplomat in a third country, then he could basically be moved to that third country without being arrested by the UK officials once he left the embassy. So we did an exclusive interview with one of his lawyers, who was actually the main person involved in this process at the time, Aitor Martinez, and he explained to us for the first time the what actually occurred, because it's quite important to establish the facts of what actually happened at this time, which the Guardian clearly didn't bother to do and still isn't bothering to do. Aitor was directly involved with arranging this diplomatic immunity. He initially presented Assange with a list of, I think, 6 countries: China, Serbia, Greece, Bolivia, Cuba, and Venezuela. all of which were happy to grant Assange diplomatic immunity. However, the Ecuadorian foreign minister at the time, her cousin worked in the Ecuadorian consul in Moscow. And so she came back about 3 weeks after they presented the initial plans. And she said, look, I can arrange Assange to be posted to Russia immediately. She printed out the diplomatic passport and everything. She said, this plan's ready to go. His entire legal team, including Assange himself, all rejected this plan. They said, no, this is crazy. You've tried, you've created a plan to provide diplomatic immunity in the one country where there's, a wild media narrative at that present time being spun about Assange's links to Russia. If they post him, if they said if you post Assange to Russia now, it's going to fan the flames of these conspiracies, and it's going to do no good whatsoever. So they rejected this plan. It was at this point that Rami Vallejo visited on the 21st of December 2017 to discuss with Assange plans to get out of the embassy. One of the last minute plans was to actually post him to the UK. Which they knew would not work. However, they thought it might buy them enough time to get out of the country in a diplomatic vehicle without getting arrested. So you've got this. So at this very, very time, you've got UC Global spying, as we mentioned, on the discussions between Assange and Rami Vallejo. These end up with the US government. And then the next day, you have the US ambassador in Quito going straight to the Ecuadorian foreign minister and saying there is absolutely no way that we're going to allow Assange to flee the embassy or to leave the embassy. So the US basically, what effectively amounted to a threat to the Ecuadorian government saying we will not allow this to happen. So the Ecuadorian foreign minister basically gets cold feet, says we need to cancel the entire operation. And by Christmas 2017, the entire operation had been ground to a halt. So when this is according to people who were directly involved in the plans to get Assange to a third country. This is what they say. They say they will testify in court that this is exactly what happened. When pushed through the Guardian's disinformation machine, this came out as Assange plotted, along with various members of the Ecuadorian Embassy in London, plotted to flee illicitly from the embassy with the help of Russian officials. In this article, they claim that Fidel Narvaez, who was the Ecuadorian consul in the embassy in London at the time, they claim that he held secret meetings with Russian officials. There's a number of different spurious claims that Fidel categorically denies. There's no evidence to support these claims. They come from an unnamed official. This story. Fidel complains about this story. He says, you've made claims about me that are fictitious, not only fictitious, but dangerous as an Ecuadorian political figure. How am I supposed to get a job in the future if these claims are left unattended on your website? Eventually, The Guardian took a few steps back. They said, there wasn't, we were wrong to call it a plot. We were wrong to suggest that this was an illicit plan to get out of the embassy. Whereas in fact it was a legal plan which involved diplomatic immunity, you've got a trend of The Guardian producing disinformation which is coming from unnamed sources, and all of it leads in one direction, which is to associate Assange with Russia, in order to basically damage his character, so that people's solidarity with him and also people's willingness to protect a free press is destroyed.
And also on the Manafort story, it seems there was a secret author. Who was that?
Well, there's Fernando Vicencio, who is, by all accounts, he's a Ecuadorian National Assembly member today, but by all accounts, he describes himself as an investigative journalist. But in Ecuador, he's known for being essentially a very strident anti-Correa activist. Rafael Correa, the left-wing former leader of Ecuador, initially granted political asylum to Julian Assange. So he's been a very strident anti-Correa activist. His reporting has come under severe questioning, both in Ecuador, in in the UK, and it's curious that he's omitted from the article in one of the versions of the article. So today he's a politician. Continues, if you go to his Twitter page today, he seems obsessed with Korea. His pinned post from today is a critique of Korea, and so he's quite an influential figure in Ecuador, ostensibly an investigative journalist and now a politician.
Why is it interesting that The Guardian never produced any form of video or photo evidence for Paul Manafort's visit to Julian Assange?
Yeah, I think this is the key question, really, and this is a question that The Guardian's three authors who worked on this story have never been able to provide an answer to. We know from Fidel Narvaez that nobody could enter the embassy without logging in, without being caught on the CCTV, without providing their names, without providing some form of identification, without having an official request to the ambassador in advance to let them know that they were arriving. So you've got this claim that Paul Manafort, one of the most recognisable politicians in US politics at the time, arriving in London, one of the most surveyed cities in the world, if not the most surveyed cities in the world, and going to the Ecuadorian Embassy in London, which at the time was one of the most surveyed places in central London itself. And supposedly he's managed to do this and I mean, they even say in the article that he doesn't arrive in disguise. He's wearing a pair of brown chinos and a cardigan or something. I forget exactly how to describe it. So he supposedly arrives in this incredibly surveyed area. He manages to sneak into an embassy that records everybody who enters digitally and registers their name and personal information, and somehow manages to do this on 3 separate occasions, one of which was during the 2016 election campaign. And they didn't think maybe if this occurred, there should be some form of CCTV evidence for it or video evidence. And this becomes even more sinister when you consider that Stephanie Kirsch-Geisner, over the preceding months before this story was published, was communicating with a source at UC Global, the security firm based at the Ecuadorian Embassy. And she was consistently asking for different forms of video footage, video footage of different things happening, such as Assange standing out on the balcony. And she's also asking for records of the visitor's log so that she can try and prove whether Nigel Farage visited the embassy just once or twice or however many more times. So basically, you've got one of the Guardian's key columnists is very much aware that they can access video footage or camera footage from within the embassy. Did they even bother to ask for this story? I mean, were they so keen to jump at this story presenting Assange as a Russian, a Russian agent, that they basically bypassed the key evidence that any journalist should have required to prove what they were claiming.
Also, in this attempt to sort of paint Assange as of the right, there has been the story that Nigel Farage supposedly visited him also. Is that true?
John, you can. Yeah,
I mean, it's true that he visited Assange once. I forget the date. I forget the date now, but it's true that he visited once. I mean, this was covered across the corporate media. I mean, this was actually covered with the help of pictures. Assange was pictured outside of the embassy, unlike Paul Manafort. As soon as Farage entered the embassy, he was instantly recognisable, which is what you would assume would have happened with Manafort. However, there were claims that Farage visited Assange at the embassy a second time, which seems patently untrue. He doesn't appear a second time in the visitor's log. And the second time where he supposedly visits is at the time when Assange basically the Ecuadorian government had stopped allowing him visitors, had removed certain rights from Assange. So it seems quite clearly untrue that Farage visited Assange a second time on the date that he supposedly did. Now, what's interesting is you can trace where this claim comes from. And the original claim that Farage visited a second time comes from the same Fernando Villavicencio, who is the unnamed author on the story. So you've got someone who's consistently, who has a record at least of producing what seems like disinformation with regards to Assange. And Stephanie Kirsch-Geisner seems to be in contact with him because she's asking, "Oh, I heard, Nigel Farage has visited numerous times." One other point that's important to mention about Fernando Villavicencio, the unnamed third author, is that he has been credibly accused by the Ecuadorian government in the past of falsifying documents. According to at the time, I believe it was in 2014. It was regarding Chinese investment in a national park in Ecuador. Apparently, they produced documents with metadata to suggest that the documents that he produced had been altered after the fact. So you've got someone who it seems is quite definitely producing disinformation, not only about the Ecuadorian government but also about Assange, that the Guardian is relying on for information about Assange, crafting stories with him, and then concealing his identity as one of the authors. So that's incredibly suspect to me.
And you've had authors such as Luke Harding who have had articles retracted by the Guardian because of essentially a sort of level of plagiarism. So you've got all these figures with sort of journalistic issues in their past, being able to put out a number of stories which have a lot of internal inconsistencies, which with some cursory looking into, we put forward in that article, and as I said, it's incumbent on the Guardian to provide the credible explanation, because otherwise, at best, it just seems as journalistic malpractice. There's a wider context that we didn't, again, go into in this article, but it's about how the Guardian in the last few years has got closer to the British security services, how they've run sort of exclusives with the head of MI5 and MI6 in the wake of Catherine Viner coming, how their deputy editors have joined the D-Notice committee. So this is a wider context which adds an extra layer of sort of trouble of making these articles seem even more troubling. So, but in and of themselves, they need to sort of respond to these questions, these very, as I say, succinct and kind of straightforward questions that we've put at the end of the article. And just to take it again, to take a step out again, I mean, what the relationship overall that the Guardian seemed to have had with Assange and its reporting, I think could be fairly described as hostile. I think these two articles are kind of emblematic of that hostility. And if you look at some of the major issues of the last few years, in terms of figures who have really been considered threats by the US government or the Western establishment, Julian Assange, Jeremy Corbyn, the cases I know perhaps better in Latin America, Hugo Chavez, the Guardian has been at the forefront of campaigns of vilification towards these figures. And this is from a newspaper which is supposed to be a paragon of liberal left journalism that people look to for a progressive interpretation of world events. And I think it's highly troubling. All of this information taken as a whole is highly troubling from the point of journalism and perhaps from other spheres as well.
As a sort of parameter line of the acceptable left within this country, how does the Guardian function to limit the prospects for real participatory change in this country?
Do you want to start this one, Pablo, and I'll jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Guardian has in the past, had excellent security state journalism, but that has changed, and that's the reason why new online media outlets such as Declassified, which in the last few years has essentially taken over to become the only real outlet in the UK media that is doing the kind of UK security state reporting that the Guardian once did. As I said, with this kind of evolution in the Guardian's relationship to the UK security state. I think the Guardian has left that kind of side of its journalism, which gave it a level of credibility when it came to saying that it was holding power to account, that it was, a fearless advocate of truth-seeking journalism. In the past, it had columnists, it had a plurality, some level of plurality of opinion with regards to, say, the Latin American left. I think that's changed. And I think that I would argue that with what we saw with Jeremy Corbyn, I think the Guardian decided to just dispense with all pretensions of being a kind of liberal left newspaper, even though it kind of paid the price with its readers. There were readers who were not necessarily, I think, left wing, but that kind of realized that the extent of its hostility to Corbyn was so kind of obvious that it kind of seemed strange, the level of hostility that the Guardian had. And I think it really showed that when candidates came that didn't have the connections to this kind of political and media class that we have in the UK. I mean, just today we're living through a scandal in the UK where a former Guardian journalist, she was actually political editor of The Guardian for at least 6 years, possibly more, Allegra Stratton, ends up being the spokesperson for a right or far right government that we have in the UK. That transition is counterintuitive, but I think the more that you look into the social connections and the past of Guardian journalists, the degree to which only 1% of people in the UK go to Oxbridge, but something like 40% of these people that go to Oxbridge inhabit the upper echelons of the media class, and the fact that they kind of hang out with each other. These people, Allegra Stratton's husband is a deputy editor, I believe, of The Spectator. These people all hang out with each other, whether it's The Guardian, the Daily Mail. So it points to this kind of false idea that we have a kind of a press which is oppositional in reality to an establishment that exists and is very chummy with each other.
Absolutely. And one of the key ways in which that kind of relationship is imposed is through the D-Notice Committee. John, could you break down for us what the D-Notice Committee is?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the D-Notice Committee has existed for a long time. It wasn't initially voluntary. It used to function as it was imposed by the government when it wanted certain national security stories to be censored, basically. But in more recent years, the D-Notice Committee has basically been a voluntary system where editors of British newspapers voluntarily join the DSMA committee, and they discuss on a voluntary basis the items of potential national security with individuals from the state. It's a very British form of censorship. It remains a way of the British government to retain a level of plausible deniability that they're censoring certain news stories, and British journalists who are clearly approximate to the state to deny that they're accepting censorship. There's as far as I'm aware, there's been one D-Notice issued with regards to WikiLeaks, and that was back in 2011 with the Iraq war logs, if I recall correctly. And none of the mainstream newspapers to whom the D-Notice was sent actually publicised the fact until it was revealed by none other than Guido Fawkes, the right-wing blogger, who kind of embarrassed the government for having sent this D-Notice. So that's there's a lot more written about the D-Notice committee in a book called The History Thieves by Ian Cobain, which I'd recommend to people to know more about how it functions. But I mean, after The Guardian started publishing the Snowden leaks, and I think a lot of people remember when I believe it was MI5 went into the Guardian, or was it the Met that went into the Guardian offices?
Alan Rusbridger, and they took him to the basement.
Took him to the basement, made them destroy in a total symbolic, totally symbolically, because it didn't make any difference. They already had the files anyway, but made them destroy all of their hard drives in the basement of the Guardian. Following that, The Guardian, as Matt Kennard and Mark Curtis wrote in an article on how, on how the security services, gained a foothold in The Guardian like they had never before, described how, The Guardian joined the D-Notice Committee, Alan Rusbriger left, Kath Viner came in, and since then, some of its main national security journalists, Ian Cobain, people like Jonathan Cook as well, have either been forced out, kicked out, or been obliged to leave. Yes, I mean, the structure of The Guardian has certainly changed, especially since the Snowden leaks, I believe, in 2014, and it's no longer concerned with real investigative journalism that's going to end up embarrassing for the national security state.
Is there anything else at this point that you guys want me to ask you?
No, I mean, I don't know if it's worth just adding. Again, it's a kind of contextual thing, but I think that we've discussed a kind of perhaps a transition with The Guardian in the last few years. It's kind of rapprochement to the UK security state, but I think when explaining why we have reached a stage where we have these kind of articles, we can provide the context that The Guardian needs to explain, vis-a-vis the UK security state. But I also think that on one level, and I don't want to let them off the hook here, but just talking from experience as someone that went to live in, say, Venezuela in 2005 and had The Guardian's first correspondent in 20 years, first Latin American correspondent in 20 years, asked to meet with me and explain that he neither knew Spanish or knew anything about Latin America. So I think when trying to explain how we reach the stage where we have articles which have a lot of internal inconsistencies that get past editors, etc. I think there's a kind of ignorance and an arrogance at play, at least when it comes to foreign reporting. I'm not saying this is the case with Julian Assange or whether it's the case with Jeremy Corbyn, but I think that when it comes to there's an image of seriousness that The Guardian gives off that the facts betray, basically. And I think that only when one comes into close contact with, say, a foreign correspondent who's been sent to cover a region which is in the midst of a kind of uprising of the left, and you find out that they neither speak Spanish or know anything about the region, only then does a kind of certain reality about what these types of journalists become aware, and it kind of informs how you would evaluate these things going forward.
Yeah, I would actually like to add something as well about just if there's historical precedent to this happening, because I've been working with documents about Philippe Egi, obviously the former CIA whistleblower, and the documents they show basically a carbon copy of what's happened to Assange. So I'd like to add something about that.
Okay. So I'll ask you a question about what you've been looking into recently with around Philippe Egi, yeah?
Or if the kind of disinformation about Assange has okay. Something similar happened before.
Okay.
And Kareem, sorry, if you need to edit any of that in, that's easily.
No worries. Yeah, cool. Okay. So, John, are there any precedents in terms of this wide mobilization to bombard people with disinformation about somebody who has been responsible for showing the inner workings of power? Historically, do we have any precedents to this?
Yeah, I think it's definitely important to look historically at these kinds of cases, because I mean the Assange case at certain points seems so ridiculous in certain cases that it's actually hard to believe the degree to which the national security state has targeted him and has targeted him by way of disinformation campaigns. I've been doing a lot of work about the Information Research Department recently, and that was basically Britain's Cold War propaganda unit that was situated in the Foreign Office. And one of the things that the IRD, the Information Research Department, was doing, particularly during the 1970s, was targeting alternative media sources, one of which was the Morning Star at the time. And what they were basically doing was trying to compile files and compile information and spy on these organisations in order to create articles, sometimes partly true, often partly false, in an attempt to delegitimise them. But an even greater historical parallel that I've found recently is Philippe Agee. Now, Philippe Agee did something quite similar to Assange. He was, one of the CIA's most prominent whistleblowers, former CIA official. He wrote a really important book called Inside the Company about the CIA, which basically exposed all of their different methods of infiltration, of espionage, of counter-espionage, etc. So in the mid-1970s, the US was trying to extradite Philippe Agee from Britain to the US for having published sensitive information, classified information about US operations abroad. And the British government at this time, according to the IRD documents that I've seen, the British government was basically trying to figure out a way to reduce public sympathy for Agee in order to, facilitate his extradition to the US. And two ways in which they tried to do that is one, by painting him as a Russian asset. So you can see that they're trying to limit, especially in liberal left circles, public sympathy with Agee in order to facilitate his extradition to the US. And the other way is by accusing him of being responsible for the deaths of US agents abroad by revealing their names. So you've got almost a carbon copy of what's happened with Assange, 55 years later, more or less. 50 years later. Accusing him of one, being a Russian agent in order to dissipate all sympathy among the liberal left circles that you have at The Guardian, that you have at much of Britain's liberal media, and also to accuse him of being responsible for the deaths of US informants with the publication following, as Pablo mentioned earlier, the encrypted password to the leak. It's important to, if you look at history, this is not something new. It seems, the level to which the state services are targeting Assange seems absurd, but it's nothing new. This has happened before. I think if we look to precedents in the past, it becomes much more easy. It becomes easier to believe, that what's happening to Assange is a state coordinated campaign.
And through Assange, they target us all. Thank you so much for joining me today, gentlemen, on The Watchdog. I hope to see you both again soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.